Today's program. For the past 40 years, Commonwealth North has provided a nonpartisan forum for citizen engagement in Alaska's most critical issues. Through study groups and forums, Commonwealth North examines those issues, provides opportunities to meet and engage with leading policymakers, and develops consensus recommendations to move Alaska forward. Engagement is the key to Commonwealth North's process. During today's program, you may submit your questions via the Zoom platform chat window. If you're calling in, please take note of this number, 907-230-2284. Again, that's 907-230-2284. You may text your questions to that number. Questions should be specific to today's topic. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Terry Smith, the president of Commonwealth North's Board of Directors. Terry?
Thank you, Juanetta. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Commonwealth North's online presentation, Alaska's Role in America's Arctic Strategy with U.S. Senator Dan Sullivan. I am Terry Smith, the Chief Financial Officer for Vitus Energy and this year's president for Commonwealth North. And it's been a time of great upheaval in all of our business relationships, and it really reinforces the role of Commonwealth North in bringing people together to continue these very important policy dialogues and making sure that we bring in and keep up the continuity in discussion. So with that, Commonwealth North is pleased to host Senator Dan Sullivan to discuss Alaska's role in the nation's Arctic strategy. As we noted in our report, Why the Arctic Matters, the Arctic is vast, rich, vulnerable, and vital. Our Arctic assets help feed our nation, fuel our nation, and provide transportation routes and supply our nation and the global economy. Our strategic location helps defend many nations, Alaska and America, in its Arctic environment. Because of Alaska and the decisions made in Washington, D.C. about the Arctic affect our state and our world. We are super important. Commonwealth North recently launched its Arctic Policy Study Group to update the Arctic Matters publication. Please join co-chairs Meade Treadwell, Tom Barrett, Bob Cox, and Gail Schubert as we bring those topics forward and reprioritize our focus. Why the Arctic Matters, along with all of Commonwealth North's reports, can be downloaded from our website under the Publications section. I'd like to thank the Commonwealth North members who are online with us for your membership and tremendous work you've done through the ages to educate Alaskans, including our policy leaders, on Alaska's public policy challenges. I would also like to invite you, if you're not a member of Commonwealth North, to join us. At the end of the presentations, we will have a question and answer period. Please submit your questions through Zoom's chat window or text Juanetta at 907-230-2284. It is my great pleasure to introduce Senator Dan Sullivan, who was sworn in as Alaska's 8th United States Senator in 2015. He serves on 4 Senate committees vital to Alaska: the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, the Armed Services Committee, the Environment and Public Works Committee, and the Veterans Affairs Committee. Prior to his election to the U.S. Senate, Senator Sullivan served as Alaska's Attorney General and Commissioner of the Alaska Department of Natural Resources. He is also a colonel in the U.S. Marine Corps Reserve. Thank you for joining us today, Senator. I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Well, Terry, thank you. And Juanetta and the whole team, I just make a couple points in terms of introduction. I don't think I have to explain particularly to this group, but what the work that Commonwealth North has done for so many years. And the founder, Wally Hickel, who was a man of great ideas, which is what we're going to talk about today, but also very importantly, a man of action. And I think that that's how we need to look at our Arctic issues. Big ideas, but we have to take action. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about, what's happening with regard to America's role in the Arctic. I think Governor Hickel certainly also personified the spirit of Alaska during many challenging times. Of course, whether it was the earthquake in 1964 that decimated so many parts of our state, but again, his spirit, his attitude of getting back to work, powering through some of the big challenges we've had, I think is more important than ever today in terms of that legacy. And let's face it, Wally Hickel, I think we could also give him the title of the original Arctic statesman for America, a never tiring advocate of our role in the world. And again, I think that that's going to be more important than ever as we move forward. So what I wanted to do is, and again, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I wanted to give you kind of a sense, at least since my time in the Senate for the last 5.5 years, the trajectory of where we've been as a state, but also where we've been as a nation with regard to our role, Alaska's role with regard to the awakening, that I call it, in recognizing the importance of the Arctic. Because I think when you put it together, when you look at kind of the broad arc of what's happened, I think we've made a fair amount of progress. But I would tell you, at least in my experience, very early on, it was very clear to me that the issue that we were even an Arctic nation, America, because of our state, was something that wasn't commonly recognized. One of the first experiences I had was when President Obama's new Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, was testifying in front of the Armed Services Committee. I actually really liked Ash Carter. I helped him get confirmed in a Republican-controlled Senate. I think he was a good guy, a very smart guy. I'm sure some of you know him. But in that hearing, I held up the Obama administration's Department of Defense Arctic strategy. And to this day, I remember it well. I'm sure some of you saw it. It was 13 pages, 6 of which were pictures, and climate change was mentioned, you know, I think 6 or 7 times. And the word Russia was mentioned once in a footnote, and the word China was not mentioned at all. And all the things that we care about, certainly in the environment, but so many of the other things that makes the Arctic so important to Alaska, but so important to America, were not in this. And I threw this strategy on the dais when I was questioning Secretary Carter, and I said, with all due respect, Mr. Secretary, this is not a strategy, this is a joke. And to be honest, in private discussions, I think Secretary Carter wasn't too far in disagreement with me. I mention that because what we've been trying to do with regard to the Arctic, particularly on the military and security side, is drive the Pentagon to recognize just how important this part of the world is, not just for our state, but for the entire country. So again, I won't, Terry mentioned it, I won't go into it because you guys have already written it, but whenever I talk about the Arctic with regard to the interests at stake, your report, Why the Arctic Matters, is exactly kind of the issues that I highlight. Resources, transportation routes, strategic location, the importance of the environment, and yes, the importance of people, Alaskans, others. And I mentioned that, and I'll just touch on each of these. But again, Commonwealth North has been one of the great advocates on those issues, those interests for years and years and years. So I won't focus on it too much, but we all know with regard to the abundance of resources that this region of the world has, whether it's minerals, whether it's oil and gas, it's the estimates of undiscovered conventional oil resources for the world, almost 15% for the entire world, 30% of the natural gas, just to give you a couple factoids on that. Transportation routes, of course, this is something with regard with this receding sea ice that we're seeing increasingly important. President Putin of Russia has talked about the Arctic becoming the new Suez Canal and how they will, Russia will control it. We're starting certainly to see that. strategic location. I don't have to tell all of you. I use the famous Billy Mitchell quote almost once a week, it feels like, in the Senate Armed Services Committee, but the father of the Air Force calling Alaska the most strategic place in the world, given our location. And then there's the environment, which matters so much to us. You know, it's often described as pristine. I would call it more rugged, but certainly protecting our environment is a critical interest. And then finally, the people, all of us. I only mention this because it's so obvious to us, but again, when I'm talking about where we've come, I will tell you one of the first conversations I had as a new senator with the NORTHCOM commander, who has the strategic areas of the Arctic under his area of responsibility. I won't name them, the four-star individual, because I didn't think he did a very good job. But literally in one of my first meetings with him, he was sitting down and I was walking through how we need to focus much more on the Arctic. And this four-star member of the military said, well, Senator, nobody lives up there. That's a quote, literally. And I was like, well, Admiral, with all due respect, there's a hell of a lot of people live up there, and they happen to be the people I represent in the U.S. Senate. So I was, to be honest, very glad to see that guy go, because that was in some ways the epitome of where we were with regard to the Pentagon and the interest in the Arctic. So what's happened? I would call what's happened in the last several years, and again, I want to thank so many of you who have come to testify on the Hill, come to meet with other members of Congress. What's happened is there has been an Arctic awakening. There is no doubt about it. And what's great about this, if you look, particularly in the Congress, it's not just me and Lisa and Don. I think everybody's like, oh yeah, there go the Alaskans. They're talking about the Arctic. It is across the board, Democrats, Republicans, Senate, House, and it's coming up all the time. I'm going to conclude by giving you a couple examples of that. But that to me is very positive. The other thing, and I was going to hand it out, I don't know, Terry or Juanetta, if we passed out that interview I did recently with the Defense News that was very interested. They came to me saying, hey, this is becoming a hot topic in the Pentagon. Senator, can we talk to you about the Arctic and the military's role? But I also have this handout, and we can get it to you guys. We just have all, and I hand this out in armed services hearings all the time. But just in the last year, if you look at all the major media stories, 60 Minutes, National Geographic, the New York Times, there is like an article a week on the important strategic interests of the Arctic. So this is all good. This is all the awakening, and I think that that's been positive. The one agency, however, and it's a bit of a frustration of mine, that continues to be kind of the laggard on the recognition of our strategic interests in the Arctic, in my view, is the Pentagon. And so that's changing. But as I've said to the members, you know, whether it's the Secretary of Defense or all the senior members of the Joint Chiefs and others, you know, a lot of times Congress isn't really up to speed so much on the big national security issues, and the Pentagon leads. But I have said to them, but you know what, with all due respect, sometimes the Congress is way more up to speed on key issues in terms of national security for our nation, and the Pentagon is the laggard. And in this case, in my view, that's happening. That's happened. It's changing, however. I literally was just on the phone with the former Secretary of the Navy, Richard Spencer. Many of you met him. He came up to Alaska twice during his tenure. The new NORTHCOM commander, General O'Shaughnessy, talk about a change from that admiral I was talking about 5 years ago. He is all in on how important the Arctic is. The Air Force, I have a call later this week with the Secretary of the Air Force, Barbara Barrett. The whole point of the call is she wants to provide me with the Air Force's new Arctic strategy. So this is all, as I mentioned, changing. How does that change? Well, in the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, that the Armed Services Committee writes, we have been putting in, my office in particular, requirements for the Pentagon on a whole host of Arctic issues to press the Department of Defense to essentially get with the program. So the first one that I noted after kind of slamming the previous administration's Arctic strategy on the dais and that hearing with Secretary Ash Carter was to mandate that the Department of Defense put forward a real strategy in the Arctic. To their credit, at the end of the Obama administration, beginning of the Trump administration, they worked together on our first Arctic strategy. Some of you may have seen it. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And there's a classified version, which is even better. And it talks about countries that aren't necessarily mentioned in the unclassified version. But it's a serious document that looks at those strategic interests, all of them that I just mentioned to you at what's at stake with regard to the Arctic. So we're working on that. Every year now, the different services are updating their new Arctic strategy. That's forcing them, and again, now a lot of them are getting the issue. Where else have we made progress? Icebreakers, icebreakers, icebreakers. Can you believe it? We're finally building icebreakers. Right now, you guys all know we have 2 heavy icebreakers and 1 is broken. So we really have 1. And they're home ported in Seattle. But in the NDAA 2 years ago, I got a provision in there that authorized the purchase and construction of 6 polar class icebreakers, what the Coast Guard is now calling polar security cutters. I love that name. So we're in the process of building 2 actually right now. And but the authorization is for 6. Do I think we need more than 6? Yes. The Russians, by the way, the latest intel, it's unclassified, they have 54, some of which are nuclear powered, many of which are weaponized. So we're way behind, but you have to start somewhere. And we have started. And again, these issues are very bipartisan because people recognize how important this is. The strategic Arctic port, as I call it, that's both in Nome, but our vision is to have a series of ports throughout Western Alaska that can handle the logistical basis of protecting our strategic interests in the Arctic. Now, we still have a long way to go. There's no doubt. In the Arctic strategy of the Department of Defense, they say that they are going to require what are called freedom of navigation operations. FONOPs, as we call them in the military. We do these in the South China Sea. We're supposed to be doing them in the Arctic. We had a hearing about 1.5 years ago where I asked the Secretary of the Navy and the Chief of Naval Operations, are we doing the FONOPs? Well, Senator, no. Can we do the FONOPs? No, we don't have icebreakers to do them yet. Okay, but we are up in the Arctic in a big way. And I'm like, really, how's that? With submarines. And I'm like, I love our submarine fleet, but a freedom of navigation operation, you're supposed to be able to be seen. That's the whole point. Subs don't count. So this is an ongoing issue with regard to our military. But the other thing you may have seen recently, and it's in the North Atlantic and Norway, but it's in Alaska, the military is starting to do major military exercises, not just Northern Edge, but you may have seen the Marines did a big amphibious invasion exercise out at Adak this fall. The Commandant of the Coast Guard was there, the Secretary of the Navy was there, and we're seeing a whole host of new military exercises in our part of the world, and that's going to continue. And it's not easy, of course, to do operations in our part of the world, but it's very, very critical. So I mentioned these things. These are some of the key areas where it's actually been action. It's actually been action. The final issue with regard to the awakening that I want to talk about is the Trump administration put forward a new national security strategy, a new national defense strategy that, although you don't read about it in the media, has gotten very, very strong bipartisan support, particularly in the Senate. I would say probably 90 of the 100 US senators are supportive of this new strategy. What is it? It's really essentially turning our focus. It says, you know, post 9/11, we were focused as a nation on the threat that the extremists, terrorist organizations pose to the United States. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, they're still certainly a threat, and that was the appropriate focus, particularly post 9/11. But the new focus is, in this strategy, is what is referred to as the return of great power competition, with China as the pacing threat in terms of a geostrategic challenge to our nation. That is an entire new way that we have to look at building out our military and the strategy that we need with regard to our military. That strategy is now being recognized as there is a significant, what we call great power competition, taking place right here, right in the Arctic. And that's another awakening. You may have seen Secretary of State Pompeo, the Arctic Council meeting recently in Finland, well, several months ago in Finland, gave a really powerful speech laying this out as the Arctic as critical to America's national security, sovereignty, and the great power competition, which is happening. We don't necessarily want it, but we have to recognize it is happening in this part of the world, this part of America, which is our state. I will end by just saying the way in which we are viewing this more close to home, and it's something else that I talk about a lot in the Senate, is our state constitutes what I refer to as 3 pillars of America's military might as it relates to protecting the country. What are those 3 pillars? We're the cornerstone of our nation's missile defense, with the vast majority of the missile fields and the radar sites that are tracking missiles that would come and harm any city in America. We protect New York, Miami, LA, Chicago, and everywhere in between. That's us. And you know, it's something that I think most Alaskans have a lot of pride in. If you've ever gone to visit the 49th Missile Defense Battalion, a National Guard unit in Alaska, protecting the whole country, they have this great motto, the 300 protecting the 300 million. And we do it right here. We are also the hub of air combat power for the Arctic and the Asia Pacific. You saw the good news, I'm sure, that despite the pandemic, the Air Force kept on time, on budget with the beginning of delivery of the F-35s at Eielson Air Force Base. That means as those aircraft are bedded down with 2 squadrons of F-35s at Eielson, 2.5 squadrons of F-32s at JBER, we're going to have over 100 5th-generation fighters based in Alaska. There's no place on the planet Earth that has that, and we're going to have that. That is in addition to our other military aircraft. And we are, third, what I like to say, a strategic platform for expeditionary forces, whether it's the 425 based here at JBER or the 1st Stryker Brigade that just got back from Iraq, based up in Fort Wainwright, or all the great Guard and Reserve units that have deployed over the last several years. These are the 3 pillars. The good news is we've been able to build up these 3 pillars significantly over the last 4 to 5 years, about $1.5 billion in military construction that has certainly benefited the national security of our nation, but also the economy of the great state of Alaska. But lately, I've been talking about a 4th pillar. And the 4th pillar that we are becoming is really a logistical hub for America's Arctic operations. And that's this issue of icebreakers. That's this issue of strategic Arctic ports. We have a long way to go, but it is a vision that I think the vast majority of people, not just in our state, but literally in the Congress, are starting to recognize is important. You know, I chair the Readiness Subcommittee on the Armed Services Committee, and I chair the Security and Coast Guard Subcommittee on the Commerce Committee. So we've had a number of hearings, not a number, but a few hearings on the Arctic and national security strategy in the Arctic. What we've tried to do is lay out a vision for what that looks like. And to me, you know, the vision for the Arctic, for Alaska, for America, really for the world, you know, should be that the Arctic should remain an area of cooperation and opportunity. That's what we want. We certainly want the best scientists working to study our unique climate and ecosystem. We want the Arctic to be a leading voice for the protection of the environment, but also for responsible resource development. We want this part of the world certainly to be a peaceful region, but as you all, I think many of you believe, I certainly do, the best way to effectuate that is to show that you have strength in the region with a consistent forward American presence. And that's, again, what we are seeing as, I think, a great opportunity. Let me just end with one. As I mentioned, 6 polar class icebreakers authorized by the National Defense Authorization Act. The first 2, the Coast Guard's already announced, will be home ported in Seattle. That's where the current 2 are that are in bad shape if you've ever been out on them. So that makes sense. But where should the next 4 go? Well, I've held hearings on this already, and to me, this is a no-brainer. And it's not just a no-brainer for the congressional delegation, but really any member of Commerce. I think, of course, we should look at and make sure the vision for the home porting of those is in our state. No doubt about it. So these are some of the things that I think are exciting. I'll just give you, like I said, just in the last 2 weeks, as the Senate has gotten back to work with regard to addressing the challenges of the pandemic, the issues of the Arctic, though, are still front and center. We had the confirmation hearing of the new Secretary of the Navy, the new Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and the new Chief of Staff of the Air Force 2 weeks ago in the Senate on the Armed Services Committee. If any of you watched that, one thing that was really interesting, no surprise, I was very, very focused, Arctic, 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 Arctic. Secretary of the Navy, ports, the new Chief of Staff of the Air Force, the KC-46. That's something I think should absolutely be stationed in Alaska, and that decision is coming up soon. But what was great about that hearing, there was, I think, 3 or 4 other U.S. senators, Democrats and Republicans, who raised the issue of America's strategic interests in the Arctic. It wasn't just me. And that is a real, real big sea change that I think is going to benefit us for a long time. It's thanks to the great work that so many of Commonwealth North have been doing for years. But I will just end it on this good news point. We're breaking through. We're breaking through in a positive way. People are recognizing it. And again, at the end of this week, I think on Thursday, I'm taking a phone call from the Secretary of the Air Force, who, by the way, right when the pandemic was kicking in, she flew up to Alaska. I was going to go with her. That was part of her confirmation commitment to me. I actually stayed back to work on the legislation that we're now viewing, known as the CARES Act. Senator Murkowski did go up with her. So she was on the ground, seeing our state. She's a former ambassador from Finland, so she gets it, U.S. ambassador. The Secretary of the Navy was just our current ambassador in Norway. He gets it. But she's calling me, as I mentioned, this week. What's the purpose of the phone call? To brief me on the Air Force's new Arctic strategy. So we're making progress. We still got a long way to go. But I would say the actions that are finally starting to happen from 5 years ago when I held up that Arctic strategy that wasn't really much of a strategy at all, we've come a long way. I want to thank so many of you for doing that, being part of that, and we'll just keep pressing it together. So that's Juanetta, Terry, that's my update. I'd love to take any questions, comments, suggestions, criticisms, anything you guys want to talk about.
Okay, great. Thank you, Senator. Appreciate your comments. And we do have a number of questions coming in, so I'll try and curate those and consolidate a couple of them. A number of questions coming up because recently, of course, in the news, we've heard a number of banks develop redlining policies for investment in Arctic oil and gas, and wondering, what do you think we can do about those kinds of decisions? It seems like there's an orchestrated effort that has had all of these announcements coincide in a short period of time.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge and it's a big issue. I will tell you that we're counterattacking on this, and I can give you some of what we've been working on. But I was in a meeting with the president and a bunch of the energy executives and a couple other U.S. senators. Gosh, now about maybe 6 weeks ago, an important Alaska-based, or not Alaska-based, but Alaska operating energy company head was in that meeting as well. And this topic came up. And I have been, a number of us said, hey, when we get through the challenges of the pandemic, and we're seeing a big supply shock, a demand shock first, given the economy, a supply shock second, and I'd be glad to talk about that because I led the effort of having some very frank discussions with Saudi Arabia at the highest levels of their government, saying, you know, your actions are really, really hurting my constituents, and we think you're trying to take out our energy sector, and next time, you know, one of your neighbors invades you, don't look for the 1st Marine Division or 82nd Airborne to bail you out. You may have seen the Saudis are starting to be much more constructive, and a lot of it was the threats that we had to remove our military from protecting them. But this issue has been an important topic. I've been working closely with the president, directly with the president, with Larry Kudlow, with the Secretary of Energy, Dan Brulette, because they're very concerned. As I actually mentioned in that meeting when it came up, you know, whether you're from a state that has energy production or not, we're going to need all our cylinders in terms of the U.S. economy firing to get out of the deep recession that we're in right now. The one sector of the U.S. economy that drove us out of our recession in 2008, 2009, more than any other sector by far, was the energy sector. The investment, the innovation, the jobs. Some estimates are over half the GDP growth for the United States of America in 2011 and 2012 were in the energy sector. So hugely important. This came up. You may have seen, I was in an Oval Office meeting with the president signing the CARES 2.0 Act, and he got asked, it was a press conference, he got asked about the energy sector, and I, you know, tried diplomatically to step in and answer, you know, I said, Mr. President, can I say a few words about this? And, you know, he looked at me, said, sure, Dan, and I mentioned this issue, and I mentioned how it's dangerous for the economy of America, how it's probably illegal, and then I led an effort, and we can get it to you if you haven't seen it, Juanetta, but 36 senators and congressmen, we wrote the president. I told him the letter was coming, but it was all essentially saying, hey, this sector of the economy is going to be so important, and these big banks are doing this discrimination. And by the way, you know, these big banks, they get a lot of support from the federal government. Heck, a couple of these banks got bailed out in 2008, 2009. They have FDIC insurance. They have, they're going to do very well in helping implement this CARES Act. And we should not allow them to take it upon themselves to discriminate against this sector of the U.S. economy. You may have seen our Alaska's very own North Slope Borough Mayor Harry Brower wrote a Wall Street Journal op-ed. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It was, it really had an impact, essentially saying, you know, these folks, these banks are gonna negatively impact my community, the people I represent, in a huge way. It was a very impactful op-ed. I've been giving it to every single banker in America to read. And then I called the president after that letter I sent to him. Again, they want to be helpful on this. And then I've been calling some of the bank CEOs themselves. I won't mention which one, but one from a very large, one of the biggest banks in the country that has not signed up yet. And I called him and I encouraged him not to. And I told him I thought, you know, it was outrageous that these other banks were doing that. And to his credit, he committed to me right there and then on a phone call that they were not going to do that. And I won't name the bank, but you can probably guess it has the word America in it. And I think we need to keep the pressure on, all of us. And that's important. So we're on it, and we need to keep the pressure on.
Great, thank you. You, I think, alluded to this as well in your answer. I know that you and Senator Murkowski, as well as others, signed on to a letter calling for an investigation into the Russian Saudi overproduction and price war, perhaps leading to a tariff. And could you speak to maybe the results of that letter, and do you think that a tariff will ultimately help us or hurt us?
So I'm going to do that now. I'm sorry. I'm going to do one thing. This is the Zoom world. I just got a message that my laptop is going to die in like 2 minutes. So can I go get a plug to plug myself in before I just get dropped? So I'm sorry. Let me do this real quick. Sorry, everybody.
Okay.
Hang on 1 second.
Okay. And while the senator is doing that, I'll just again remind you, you can submit any additional questions in the Zoom chat, or you can text them to 230-2284, 907-230-2284.
Okay, sorry about that.
So Russia, Saudi Arabia.
Yes, so you know what happened is, you guys know, at the beginning of the pandemic is that, of course, we had this huge demand shock that was the U.S. economy being shut down, and essentially every economy around the world, which sent our energy prices tumbling. So that wasn't good. But at the same time, Russia and Saudi Arabia undertook a price war with each other, which was in many ways, you know, there's always two to tango, but in my view, it was more the fault of the Saudis. And if you read some of the intel on what was going on, there were some indications that both of those countries were looking to take advantage.
Alert for Malwarebytes agent.
We're looking to take
version update available.
Looking to take advantage of the pandemic as a way to literally take out the U.S. energy sector. So it was kind of an aggressive move. It was actually a really aggressive move. So as I mentioned, I led a group of senators. We wrote the Crown Prince a very frank letter. We had a very, very frank, almost 2-hour phone call with the energy minister, Abdulaziz, and then 2 different very non-diplomatic phone calls with the ambassador. And the message was that you know, we have been strong supporters of the U.S.-Saudi strategic relationship for years, and yet now, and that's benefited both countries, but now you, Saudi Arabia, are taking actions that are literally trying to wipe out a key industry of ours, and even worse, hurting tens of thousands of oil and gas workers and their families. And you're doing that to us. So I introduced legislation with Kevin Kramer from North Dakota that would remove all of our military forces from Saudi Arabia, including our anti-ballistic missile Patriot batteries and THAAD systems that protect them. And I told him in no uncertain terms, I said, I can get 67 senators to vote for this. So it doesn't even matter what the president wants to do or not do, because we'll be able to override a veto. And I think it got his attention. Some of you might know the current ambassador to Saudi Arabia, the U.S. ambassador is General John Abizaid. He was the U.S. CENTCOM commander in the Middle East during 2005 and 6 and 7. And I was a staff officer to him for a year and a half during that time. So I know General Abizaid very well. I was getting his advice on this. But we told the Saudis, you know, I literally said to them, I mean, I'll just tell you exactly what, you know, I mentioned. I said, you know, that I'm going to quote General Mattis when he showed up in Baghdad with the 1st Marine Division saying, you know, the U.S. Marines are here. We can be your best friend or your worst enemy. And I said, right now, Mr. Minister, you're on the phone with some of your biggest supporters in the Senate, but I promise you, if you continue to take actions that hurt our constituents and put thousands of them out of work, we will turn in your worst enemies, and we're going to have a very different strategic relationship. That we think helped with regard to the president's putting together, and he played a critical role. I was coordinating with his team, particularly the Secretary of Energy, on that OPEC deal that cut the production back. 2-year deal, by the way. And then the Saudis recently announced another 1 million barrel a day cut that's going to take effect in June. So they will have gone from 12.3 million barrels, which is what they announced in March, which is why in one day the price of oil dropped, I think, over 30% after they announced that, and crushed our economy, of course. They're going to go from 12.3 to 7.5 million, which is, they'll be their lowest production amount since June of 2002. That will help stabilize prices. You know, just think about it. 5 weeks ago, we were at 0 oil price. We're now at mid-30s, which isn't great, but it's a lot better than we were. Is there more to do? That's the point of your question, Winetta, and I think there is. I have asked Senator Jim Inhofe from Oklahoma and Senator Kevin Kramer and I had a recent phone call with the Secretary of Commerce, and we asked them to look at 232 tariffs on this Saudi and Russian oil, which in my view, if you read the intel, was dumped to actually take out some of our industry. And we should look at possibly putting tariffs on that, on those imports. I'm not sure they're going to do it, but Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of Commerce, said they were looking into that. But as I've said to him and the president, and I think all Alaskans agree with this, if we come out of this pandemic and one of the results is the U.S. energy economy has been destroyed, that's not going to be good for Alaska. It's not going to be good for America. It's not going to be good for our workers and families. And these two countries we're looking at trying to do that. I think we've pushed back on that enough, but you know, it was a huge issue, and I think they were really trying to take advantage of the global crisis that was hitting everybody by trying to take out our energy sector, which in my view is completely unacceptable.
Great, thank you. We've had a couple of questions about Space Force. And I note that the historic launch in Florida today was scrapped. But is there a role for the Pacific Spaceport facility in Kodiak in the Space Force? And should Anchorage be submitting itself for consideration as a headquarters for Space Force?
So, you know, I think there's a huge role for our state. I mean, as I mentioned, we're the cornerstone of missile defense. We have worked hard, again, in the defense bill to make sure the Pacific Spaceport in Kodiak gets work from the Pentagon. You may have seen that they've actually increased a fair amount of the activities there. And just given our location, how important all of this is for us, I was a skeptic, I will tell you. I was initially not supportive of the Space Force. We had a number of hearings on it. And I did actually kind of, you know, you look at these things, you study. One of my big issues was, you know, and this again goes to that kind of Arctic strategy I held up. From 2010 to 2015, the Department of Defense budget was cut by 25%. Readiness of all of our services plummeted. Again, I'm in charge of the subcommittee in charge of that. You may remember right in 2015, the previous administration was going to get rid of the 425 when they cut an additional 50,000 active duty Army troops. We were able to fight back on that one and keep them. That would have really hurt our economy in South Central, but also the national security interests of the country. So to me, my focus has been on, we got to get readiness back in the current services we have. Let's talk about the Space Force later. But after a number of hearings and briefings, I actually thought it made sense. And the ability to focus, particularly one service on the critical aspects of our national security in space, is going to be really important. It became a very bipartisan issue. And look, I'm always looking for building up our military forces, headquarters, cutters, you know, KC-46s, you name it, in our state. You know, I always say one of the things that we really have an advantage over a lot of other communities, and I think we take it for granted. I think we even think that it's normal, but it's not always normal, is how supportive everybody in Alaska is of our military. Doesn't matter political party. Everybody here supports our military in part because we have so many veterans, more veterans per capita. But it's not always the case. You know, as we were celebrating the arrival of the F-35s just last month in Fairbanks, a lot of us had to do it virtually. The Community Council of Burlington, Vermont continued its issues of voting on the fact that they don't want the F-35s in Burlington, Vermont. They don't want them anywhere near them. They're too loud, I guess. So, you know, trust me, I've had a discussion with some very, very, very senior DOD officials saying, hey, if Burlington, Vermont really doesn't want those F-35s, I know of a state that'll definitely take them. So we should definitely look at the headquarters on Space Force. I think, I know that Colorado's working it hard given their current Stratcom headquarters there, but it's something that, yes, it's a great question.
All right. And several other questions about how do you characterize China's strategic interest in the Arctic? And do you have any reaction to their announcement today that Hong Kong is no longer an autonomous entity?
Yeah, you know, I think that we, you know, China's a hugely important country, obviously. You know, when I got to the Senate, I used to give a speech about once a month, maybe once a quarter, just on, hey, yes, we have challenges like Al-Qaeda and ISIS from a national security standpoint, but the big challenge that we're not looking, the big geostrategic challenge for America in the next 50 to 100 years is the rise of China. And I literally had speeches where I was saying, nobody's talking about it. Well, the good news is it's kind of like the Arctic. The awakening with regard to the challenges that China poses for our country has happened. That speech that I used to give on the Senate floor, you can't give now. Everybody's talking about China. And this is prior to the pandemic. I think the pandemic is obviously accelerating a lot of the trends that were happening. But I gave a speech at the Heritage Foundation last year, essentially saying, you know, there's a new Cold War with China. It wasn't a Cold War that we sought. To the contrary, we were trying to bring them in as what one really good diplomat, Bob Zellick, said was as a responsible stakeholder. You know, the system that the United States set up after World War II has benefited the world, but probably benefited China more than anyone. They need to come in and be part of that system, help reinforce it, and that will benefit the system, that'll benefit all countries. China has clearly rejected that offer of being a responsible stakeholder, and they're putting forward their own model, their own authoritarian model that they're trying to get other countries to adopt. And I think it's a huge challenge for us. Are there opportunities? Sure. You know, China's become Alaska's biggest export market. But as long as they continue non-reciprocal trade practices, unfair trade practices like stealing our intellectual property and other things, and massively building up their military in places like the South China Sea, it's something that we need to be aware of, and we're going to play a really, really important role. Alaska, with regard to how to deal with it, given our strategic location. So, you know, the challenges seem to be going in a increasingly more difficult direction. The Chinese response with regard to the pandemic, their lack of transparency, their lack of accountability, their trial balloon attempt to actually blame the pandemic on some US soldiers in Wuhan, they all show the challenges. And I think the one thing that we always have to keep in mind, and I've spent a lot of time over there, including early in my Marine Corps career as a Marine in the Taiwan Strait during one of those crises on a US Navy ship, is that the number one overriding thing that animates the Chinese, the number one thing, and they admit it, is to make sure that the Chinese Communist Party stays in power. That's it. That's number one. And everything else falls from that. So I think what you're seeing in Hong Kong is a demonstration of that. I just worry that those challenges are going to get a lot more, they're going to loom a lot larger more quickly given this pandemic. And again, I think our state's going to play an important role as we look at the big challenges that we see with regard to the rise of China. And it's going to be something that we need to be strategically focused on with our allies for years, for decades. And I think the awakening of that, like the awakening of the Arctic, is starting to happen in the Congress.
Senator, how do you think Alaska can promote the establishment of a naval base in Alaska to help address some of these growing geopolitical challenges, both in the Arctic and around the Pacific Rim? Because, you know, obviously the issues with China that you've just addressed, but also just the increased traffic in the Bering Strait and what political tensions might arise because of those things and the closeness between Russia and Alaska in those circumstances.
So, I think the most important thing that we're doing right now is we're building up the infrastructure. So, for example, what I've been trying to do is really attack the infrastructure issue as it relates to shipping in the Arctic, both from the Environment and Public Works Committee, on which I sit, and the Armed Services Committee. So you may have seen, again, just in the last couple weeks on the EPW committee, we reported out 21-0, by the way, so fully bipartisan, what's called the WRDA bill, the Ports and Harbors bill. It's got a whole section that is focused on the Port of Nome and a big study that the Corps is going to do on a deep water draft port. Finally, I won't bore you with all the details of how we had to go back and forth with the Corps, but that's going to be in there. There's a placeholder. The Corps' chief's report is going to come. It's going to be expensive, but the key there is that that will be the first port, and I think it should be a series of port. There's Port, Point Spencer, which is the territory, the Bering Straits territory that they own, land above Nome. There's Cape Blossom and Kotzebue. There's a whole host of ports that I think, a series of ports that we should start building. But the Nome one is that's going to be able, and we were very specific on the dimension that will be able to handle a destroyer or a heavy icebreaker. Right now, we don't have anything that can do that. The closest thing that can handle those kind of ships to our Arctic area near the Bering Strait is either Dutch Harbor or Anchorage. And as I say in committee hearing after committee hearing, nobody on the East Coast would find it acceptable that you have Fort Lauderdale covering up to Boston. Well, we need to fix that. But I think, as opposed to us, because I think sometimes we can scare people. We say we need a Navy base. We just got to start. We got to start with getting the ports to be able to handle that. So let me just give you an example. In the NDAA, the last couple of years, I put in this provision called the Secretary of Defense will designate a strategic Arctic port. That was a new term. We came up with it. The Pentagon didn't like it. It's a new military term. It's in the Pentagon. They fought it. They fought it. They fought it. We put it back in the NDAA, the Defense Authorization Act, each year. They're going to designate a place again with certain criteria that we put in the law. And so to me, the way we do this is both have the capacity and then look at other areas. For example, as I mentioned, I was out at ADAC with the former Secretary of the Navy. By the way, the current Secretary of the Navy, you may have seen in his confirmation hearing, he was actually stationed at ADAC. So that's also good. That is something that the U.S. Navy is publicly talking about starting to warm up that base to bring sub-hunters back and deploy out there. So we have options. It's going to take some time, but it's either warming up bases that we used to have or building out bases. But I think that long term, this is going to happen. It's certainly part of the vision I think is important for Alaska and the country, and to get our icebreakers stationed there. So it's going to be a work in progress, but if you look where we've been in the last 5 years, I think we've made significant progress on it. This WRDA bill is a real kind of exclamation point on it, because it lays it out very much in the Ports and Harbors bill. And then the new Secretary of the Navy, in his confirmation hearing, when I asked him the question, are you committed to a strategic Arctic port in Western Alaska? Yes, Senator, I am. He didn't even dodge. He didn't even hedge. That's important. So we're going to get him up to Alaska. I'm sure he'll meet with all you guys. But I think that in that regard, we have some bright prospects for our state and our country. Nation needs this. This isn't just about Alaska.
Okay. Senator, with your indulgence, do you have time for 2 quick additional questions?
Sure.
A little bit over time. So you, in your initial comments, talked about the Arctic being a region of cooperation and opportunity. And along those lines, these next 2 questions, I think, trying to address both of those aspects of the Arctic. Do you see that there's an opportunity for using the telecommunications infrastructure in the Arctic, and for leveraging that telecommunications infrastructure in the new Arctic strategy for America, as well as do you see a role for Alaska in terms of playing a role for energy transition to new and renewable energy sources, particularly because many of them are reliant on the mining sector, which of course would make them look at the resources available in Alaska and the Arctic?
Yeah, I would say the answer to both of those questions is yes. So let me give you another kind of a good, I didn't mention in my remarks, but it's another one of these kind of good news stories. But it's also a recognition of just how important our state is to our whole country. The #1 unfunded requirement, so that's kind of Pentagon speak for, hey, this is really important, but it didn't make it exactly into the budget. But Congress, if you're looking to spend more on the DoD side, this is what we really need, was General Shaughnessy put this forward in a hearing that I had on the Arctic, was the low Earth orbit satellite system that he wants to cover the Arctic. This is NORTHCOM's #1 unfunded requirement for the entire Northern Command. That's a huge deal. It's a huge deal because strategically, why do they want that? They want to be able to cover, you know, they're starting to see particularly what they call hypersonics. So the threat of hypersonics, these aren't just, you know, ballistic missiles that threaten the United States. These are the ones that kind of that fly low and fast and much more on a flat trajectory. That one avenue of approach into America writ large, not just Alaska, but the whole country, is that avenue of approach through the Arctic. And they want to be able to cover that. That again shows just how important we are. So they are looking at low Earth orbit satellites that they want to be able to put up that can cover that, and you can essentially bootstrap commercial comm architecture on that could really, really help our state with regard to its telecoms and internet coverage. A complete win-win, DoD side and civilian communications side in the Arctic. We are very close. I had a phone call with the Secretary of Defense, Lisa, Don, and I just last week on pressing for this issue. So that's just a great example of where the big Department of Defense is seeing the architecture and what we don't have and what we lack up here, particularly on the communications side, is not just important to Alaska, but literally important to the defense of the United States, which is why he has put that in there as his top priority. You know, on the energy side, and I think all of you are, I'm a 100% all of the above energy advocate. We have so much energy here, not just oil and gas, but with regard to renewables, that the opportunities are huge. And we need to look at, and in my view, responsibly develop all of those different energy sources. You know, you go to different parts of our great state, heck, Kodiak is almost 100% renewable right now between the hydro and the wind turbines. So we have energy in abundance. My whole goal is to make sure we're trying to develop responsibly all of it, if it benefits us and then benefits others, whether it's our allies or other Americans, so much the better.
So one last question with regard to cooperation. How do you see, I mean, obviously there's this rising awareness about the importance of the Arctic, both as you've talked about within Congress and the administration and in other nations. So do you think the Arctic Council will remain relevant as an avenue for cooperation in the Arctic, or do you think that maybe other multilateral organizations are needed or might develop to help advance cooperation in the Arctic?
You know, I think it's a great question. I think the Arctic Council has actually gotten a boost in the last couple of years. You might remember the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, hosted that here in our state, which was great and really important. And the fact that he went you know, a lot of us got to participate in that was really important. Then you see Secretary Pompeo going to the last year's Arctic Council with regard to that being in Finland, giving a pretty, I would say, robust speech on the importance of the Arctic. The one issue, and you know, it was really clear, I wasn't in the meeting, but you know, the ministers had a dinner in Fairbanks. And you probably got a read out of that when Secretary Tillerson was the lead on that. It became a little bit of a cantankerous meeting because most of the Arctic countries, who are very close allies of ours, were not happy with the actions and the role that the Russians are playing. And I think that was a very legitimate point to raise with Lavrov, who came up to, you know, to Alaska for that. So, you know, I think it's going to be up to a number of the countries. I always say, is there going to be cooperation with, when I'm asked cooperation with the Russians in the Arctic, my answer is that's going to be up to the Russians. We would welcome cooperation. But if you have a country, I mean, just look at what they've been doing here. I think in the last 2 months, we've had 3 different Bear bomber flyovers where we've had to go intercept them. A lot of it is going to be dependent on their actions. What I don't think we should do is in any way, shape, or form, you know, look weak with regard to our capabilities up here. And that, in my view, particularly with Putin, that's the way you actually get more provocations if you're kind of not standing up to it. So we'll see. I certainly hope there's more opportunities for cooperation, but that Fairbanks Arctic Council, you know, the readout I got was that there was a great cooperation among, I think, 7 of the 8 countries, and 1 was a little bit isolated, given that people were pretty upset with their actions in the Arctic. I mean, just go ask the Norwegians what they're dealing with on almost a daily basis with regard to Russian aggression. And but look, the whole goal, as I mentioned, the vision is a peaceful, prosperous place. We can certainly get there. And I think the fact that our Congress, our federal government is starting to finally pay attention is a very promising trend that we're going to keep pressing.
Wonderful. Well, having been a staffer to an elected person, I know that your folks are probably in the shadows there, champing at the bit to try and get you on to the next thing. So we do.
Well, I'm actually, you know, I got home Friday. I'm in quarantine, right? So I'm at my house. We're doing work, but I'm just allowed to go out for a run, and you know, but I'm here with all my girls, all my daughters, and my wife, and so we're doing good. But yeah, great. I'm not leaving my house very far. Governor's orders, I guess.
All right. Well, we appreciate your time, Senator. And we've had lots of very in-depth and well-informed questions that we haven't gotten to today. I apologize to the folks online who've submitted questions that we weren't able to get to in depth, but you've done definitely a yeoman's job of trying to answer all the questions that we've thrown at you.
Well, if you guys, if you want, if you can make sure my team gets those, and we could certainly get back and answer them to whoever asks the questions.
Absolutely. We'll consolidate them and share them with everybody if that's okay with you.
Great.
All right.
Good.
All right. Let me throw it back to Terry for some final words.
Very good. Thank you, Senator Sullivan, and just appreciate your ideas, the details. This organization thrives on the details so that we can bring them forward, discuss them, deliberate them, and form long-term policy for the state. So we appreciate the information that you shared today. Commonwealth North also needs everyone's support to continue our mission through the COVID recovery. Please consider donating or supporting our studies through a company donation. Thank you all for joining us today, and I encourage you to become a member of Commonwealth North if you are not. You can become a member online at www.commonwealthnorth.org. Thank you, and we are adjourned.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Keep up the great work. Thank you.